Welcome in, I'm Artris, and in this video we're going to be going over the OP16 meta and which decks will be the best to play in a competitive environment. Because this list will be speculative, please keep in mind that this is my opinion, so if my opinion differs than yours, that's totally fine. Let me know in the comments. All I ask is you just keep it respectful. But before we go through all the decks, if you're new to the channel, please make sure to hit that sub button and give the video a thumbs up. It helps out the channel so much. Thank you all for the support. Additionally, if you'd like to talk about the One Piece card game outside of the YouTube comments, please make sure to join the Discord. The link for that is in the description below. The way that I structure my tier list are based off of S through F performances, S being decks that will be meta defining. These decks you will see quite often at big tournaments, and they will often be able to win or have a big percentage in the top cut. A tier decks are event topping decks or decks that will likely be able to make top 16 pretty consistently. They will have chances of winning pretty easily against some of the top tier decks, but maybe there's a deck in the S tier that is holding them back from being the best deck. B tier decks are the competitive decks that might not necessarily be as consistent in getting into top cut. You could expect them to easily get into top 64 and probably top 32 in some capacity. The C tier are for rogue decks, ones that might need a lot of practice in order for them to be good, or specific pilots are going to be able to handle these decks a lot better. The F tier is going to be for the decks that you should just leave at locals. I wouldn't feel comfortable taking these to a big tournament because maybe they have performance issues. Any deck that falls in this category doesn't necessarily mean that it is an awful deck, although some will be, but for the most part, these are decks that could perform in a bigger tournament, but most likely will just be best to be able to take to a local tournament. So without further ado, let's get right into this tier list. Starting off, we're going to talk about starter deck 21 Luffy. In previous videos, there's been times where I've left this leader out and people have always been really upset about me leaving it out for some reason. So we're going to keep it in the tier list for the time being. And actually what's interesting here is that it will be pretty decent, or at least we can speculate that it'll be pretty decent with the starter deck support that's coming out rather soon. I think it's within a month of this video. And so starter deck 21 right now is an F tier leave it locals deck, but I actually think that it will be boosted, or at least it should be boosted based off of the starter decks that will be coming out rather shortly. Red Shanks was a leader that I had put into the leave it locals tier in the previous set for OP15. However, there are a couple of cards that came out randomly in red, one of them being a 2k counter for red hair pirates that actually protects your board rather easily. The other card, of course, is going to be the 5-cost Ben Beckman blocker that on 10 Dawn you can bring out a Shanks along with it. So of course you're going to be playing out your 10 cost along with a blocker, which you couldn't do in previous sets. Both of those things combined actually boost this leader up, and it's really random that we're getting this support right now, but I'm glad to see it because I do think Shanks is somewhat of a fun deck. It can be linear, but of course I think that this deck has a lot of strength and potential if people aren't familiar with playing against it, or if they just so happen to go against somebody that has the God curve with Shanks. This deck is very difficult to beat. I think it's going to be a competitive deck. I don't necessarily see it consistently topping. The problem with this deck in sets past have been, well, you draw what you get and you get what you draw. So you have to be able to find exactly the pieces you need along the way. You do have searchers, of course, with Uta and the 1-cost event searcher that can find cards you might need. And now that we have more of a reason to go full red hair pirates, I think that this will have more consistency, but unfortunately, I don't think that it will fare well in an overall huge tournament. I could see it easily getting top 32, but I don't think it's going to be winning any tournaments anytime soon, although I hope that I am wrong here. For OP16 Red Ace, this is a new leader that says activate main once per turn. You can give one of your Monkey D. Luffy or one of your Whitebeard pirates with 8,000 power or more rush this turn. I think that a lot of people have clowned on this leader in general because, to be quite honest, not a lot of great support came out in this set for it. You have to run a lot of 8,000 power body stinkers that aren't necessarily that strong in general, so you're having to build your deck around these cards that are just mediocre for the most part. The other pieces in the deck that allow you to at least take full advantage of putting those cards in your deck are very contingent on you finding them and finding time to play them, that being the 5-cost Ace and also the 4-cost Luffy. Both of those cards are really good for this deck because of the fact that it allows you to be tankier without having to expend a lot of cards out of hand. But once those cards are removed from the field, oftentimes I find myself being really bricked up. This deck runs a lot of non-counter cards, and of course the 5-cost Ace that allows all of your 8,000 power characters to be 2Ks in hand. If that's gone or you don't even see it, then you're just running a lot of bricks. So this will suffer from that, but I do think that this will do well in some tournaments. I could see it being a C tier rogue deck. I don't think it's the worst deck to come out of OP16. Next up for red-green Luffy, this deck has proven itself to do well time and time again. I think it has a fair matchup into Purple Enel, although I will say Purple Enel feels like it's slightly more advantaged. Nami might be a little bit more difficult for this leader, and of course I'm not entirely sure how it will fare into Teach, but I don't suspect it will do quite well considering Black Yellow Teach runs a lot of 12,000 power bodies and also turns this leader effect off with its blockers. So I think that it will struggle against some of the top decks in the meta, but I do think it will actually be able to handle a lot of the decks underneath it. That being said, I think this is an A tier deck, probably towards the bottom end of A tier, almost a B tier deck in general, but I do think that this deck in the hands of the right pilot does very well. On to Red Green Krieg from OP15. This this leader didn't do well in the previous meta, and it didn't get anything to help it in this set, or at least not anything significant to help it in this set. But that being said, Krieg would have some good matchups against aggro decks, and we're going to see a little bit of a rise in aggro decks, of course, with green-blue Luffy, or Goofy as we like to call him there. This leader, I think, will fare well against some of those decks, but in general, I think it's going to have a rough matchup in bigger tournaments. I'm going to put it at the leave it locals tier, although I do expect this to rise up a little bit more maybe as the meta shapes out. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't feel like a very strong pick in comparison to what else you could take to bigger tournaments. Onto red-green starter deck 30, Luffy and Ace. This leader is a 6k leader with 4 life. It reads, if you have a character with 7,000 power or more on your side of the field, then give this leader minus 2,000 power. So you have to play characters that are 6,000 power or lower in this deck. Otherwise, you're going to suffer from that minus 2,000 power. And then the second part of the effect says, on your opponent's turn, all of your aces and Luffy gain 3,000 power. So it makes it a lot harder to swing back into them, especially if they are sitting there at 9,000 power on defense. I think this leader has a very interesting playstyle. You're running a lot of good red and green 6,000 power characters. They don't all have to be Ace or Luffy. You can run things like Yasop or the 6-cost Law Blocker. So I do think that this leader is probably going to be somewhat of a competitive pick. I think it's probably towards the bottom end of the competitive tier. I would expect it to probably be able to get into the top 32 in some tournaments. Will it consistently get there? Probably not. I think it's one of those decks that over time will probably end up falling in the tier list for OP16, but I do think that in some tournaments this will probably end up doing well. So I'm going to put it at the bottom end of competitive, but it's probably closer to the top end of the C tier. Onto red blue Ace from OP13. This is a leader that I think will continue to be good in this set. I think it fell off a little bit in OP15 because Lucy definitely was a deck that answered it very well. And also unfortunate for Ace, Purple NL was somewhat of a difficult matchup if you didn't see your right pieces. That being said, there's a lot of Whitebeard Pirates support in red that came out this set, specifically the Moby Dick stage, which I think actually really helps this leader overall. Just being able to grab any card off the top 3, and then at any point in the game, if you don't have Dawn underneath your leader, you can just trash it and then put a Dawn underneath your leader, allowing your leader ability to at least be procced if that's the case. That being said, I think we'll see less Lucy in general. I think a lot of the Lucy players have started to try different decks or wane off of that leader in general. And so if Lucy's not as prevalent in this meta, I do think that this Ace deck could be a pretty good pick overall. So I'm going to put it at the top of A tier for now. I think we'll change it as we go along. And as a reminder, I'll try to do my best for the S and the A tier to be in the numerical order of where I think they fit. But when we get to the B and the C and the F, we'll just put them in as is. And if there is any reason to move things around, we'll do so. Red blue Vivi is up next. And I do like this leader, but I think that if you're going to play a red blue leader, Ace probably makes a little bit more sense. With red blue Vivi, you could just add good stuff from blue and red. And we definitely got a couple of cards that could be considered good stuff. The 8-cost Newgate, if you want to build around that, could be something to add into this deck. If you want to build more of an Impel Down style package, you could also do that as well. I think Mr. 3 Galdino is probably going to be included in a lot of blue decks in general going forward. So this is an option for Vivi. But unfortunately, I don't think Vivi is going to be very strong in the scope of the meta. So I think I'm going to put her in the F tier, just leave it locals. She's a very good deck in general, but I don't think that she's going to be able to compete with some of the top dogs. On to red blue Lucy, one of my personal favorite decks in a hot minute here. I'm going to try to not be biased. In fact, I think that Lucy actually fell out of favor in this set a little bit because of the fact that there's a lot more aggression in general. We're seeing things like green blue Luffy be very aggressive towards decks, and it's kind of hard to deal with that unless you start teching for those decks. Also, purple got Sakazuki, which makes it very difficult for Lucy to be able to handle decks like maybe purple yellow Rosinante, whereas before it was a little bit easier. You have to actually worry about your Sabo blockers now, because if you tap them sideways, they have a good way of getting rid of them. So I think that Lucy will find its way in the meta eventually. I think to start off with, it's going to be rough for Lucy mains to kind of figure out exactly what to be doing here and there. I think it's a very competitive deck. I think it could potentially be an event topping deck. It's probably towards the top end of B, maybe the bottom of A. It has a pretty solid matchup into the black yellow Teach, and also has a great matchup into Nami. Unfortunately though, purple and L, spoiler alert, will be in the S tier, and that deck is very difficult to deal with, especially if they see the nuts. Because it has some good matchups into decks that are in the S and A tier, I think that Lucy will probably still be an A tier deck, but probably towards the bottom of the A tier and maybe towards the top of the B tier. I think this is a leader that will not see too many people play in general, but I do think that those who do play it will be able to figure out the meta and do well against most things. Red Purple Luffy was actually a pretty solid deck last set, and I think it actually will continue to be strong this set. I think it's more of a C tier rogue deck though. I think with the addition of the Sengoku in purple, this is something you could run in this deck and feel pretty confident doing. You don't have to use the secondary effect of being able to ramp back up. The main thing we're playing it for is the minus 6,000 power, which could could be very huge in this deck. Being able to trade into the board is always a nice thing. So I'll put it into the rogue tier. I don't expect a lot of people to play this deck overall, but I think that those who will play it might find their way into some top cut, but it's going to be one of those, it's like a hard ask for this leader because I don't think a lot of people are playing it in general. Red Purple Roger also is a very strong deck, but it's very dependent on what you draw. I think this is a competitive deck. I could see it being a B tier that didn't get really much in terms of support for this set. I don't think you're going to want to run Sakazuki in this leader. I think you're going to stick to what you were running before, like Roger Pirates and like pretty good top end, like the Rush Shanks. I think this leader being a 7 to 9k leader in the end game stages can be very tricky for a lot of decks to overcome, especially if we see a rise up of aggro. Of course, aggro is going to be able to burst this down early, but with Roger, you can ramp up pretty quickly and get to that 10 Dawn, so you're a 7k leader on defense. So I do think that this is a competitive deck. I'll probably put it a little bit above Red, Green, Luffy, and Ace. The big problem with this deck, by the way, is that the card draw sometimes is not there, and so you can actually easily run out of resources. Same thing with Roger. Eventually, you'll just run out of resources because card draw is not your strong point. I think being very tanky and defensive is. So I do think that this is a competitive deck. It just sometimes suffers from consistency. Red Black Kobe got some support in previous sets, which would have normally made this a very strong leader, but I don't think it does well against yellow decks in general. I mean, of course, that could be up for discussion, but with it having trouble against decks like Purple Enel and like Nami, I think that we didn't really see much of this last set, and I don't think we'll see much of it this set either. It has potential to do well, and of course, if you have a really good bracket run, this could pop off, but I think it's one of those decks that's going to need exactly that, a really good bracket run, and you're going to need to have a good pilot on it as well to be able to be cool under situations where you might be at 1 or 0 life with not a lot of cards in hand. So that being said, I think it's a rogue deck. It could potentially pop up here and there, but it's going to need a lot of heavy lifting in its matchups. Red Black Sabo is a deck that I really personally enjoy. I think it's one that has a lot of good cards out for it already, and eventually we'll get some more with the starter deck coming up pretty soon. So this deck will probably be a deck that is already somewhat decent and just exploded into possibly a competitive or event topping tier. That said, right now, I don't think it's going to be a deck I would want to take or at least practice with in a bigger, larger setting. I will say it could be good, and those that might practice on it a lot know their matchups well. And of course, if you go against decks that go tall, for instance, against Ace, and you're running things like Stussy, I think this leader actually is pretty solid. It could be a rogue tier deck. I don't want to put it at the leave it locals because I do think that there is some potential with this, and of course, we'll see it do better over time. But for now, I think I'll put it at the bottom of C. Red Yellow Sabo has like pretty much no competitive results as of lately, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. I think that this deck is actually pretty scary because it runs things like the new Yellow Slop with obviously the Thriller Bark Pirate package. You have the opportunity to put that new 6-cost Moria into life if you so choose, and then of course get that huge trigger going and getting 3 bodies in a turn. You have access to the 8-cost Yellow Teach, which is a pretty good card for yellow in general. That being said, I don't think that a lot of people are going to be playing this. I don't think we're going to see it in a competitive setting. I think this deck is more of a locals deck. You're probably going to be able to wreck locals with it, but if you go to a big tournament, I think that a lot of other decks will be able to out-sustain you and out-pressure you. So I think that Red Yellow Sabo is probably more of a leave it locals deck for now, but I do really respect this leader. On to Red Yellow Bonnie. Not a lot has come out in this set for this leader specifically, although you could run like the 8-cost Secret Rare Teach. I think a lot of yellow decks could experiment with that, and Bonnie is definitely one of those that could as well, but I don't think it necessarily fits into what she's trying to do. She's trying to be more of a defensive leader, playing the 7-cost Zoro or like the 10-cost Luffy that becomes a blocker. All of these things buffer on defense, and that's exactly where she wants to be. Unfortunately, she didn't see too many results in the last set, and I think we'll see very similar things for her in this set, where she will probably be a very good local warrior, but I don't think that if you're going to take her to a big tournament, I think if you go against like a Purple Enel or like a Nami or anything that can just really be able to block her up, survive long enough to and then hit for really hard, looking at Black Yellow Teach as well, then I think Bonnie could have some issues there. That being said, I think that she's more of a leave it locals deck for the time being, unfortunately, but I do think that she has a lot of weaknesses towards the top end. On to her green counterpart in Green Bonnie. This leader, I don't think got too much in terms of support for this leader either, but it didn't need it. It's one of those leaders that for, I guess, until the end of time, it's just a good generic leader ability to be able to negate 1 attack every turn based off of your leader ability. You will struggle against Teach because Teach can just turn that off, and that of course is your whole game plan, is being able to rest big things or just rest things in general and then respond accordingly. But at least if you're going against things like Black Yellow Teach, you can have your on plays there so you can KO things with Shanks. But that being said, I don't know if Bonnie is necessarily going to be a deck we'll see a lot of. It is a competitive deck. I'm going to put it in the B tier because I would expect this. The Bonnie mains that run it will do well with it. There's probably like 10 of them out there in general, but that being said, those 10 players are extremely good at Bonnie. Green Jinbei in general has not seen too many results. I do think that this deck has been slept on in the past, but I don't think it's one where people are sleeping on it now. I think it's rightfully fit into the meta of being a deck you're probably not going to take to a big tournament. It's a leave it locals deck for me, although you do have access to a new Straw Hat 7-cost Zoro. You also have the 7-cost Boa, which is unblockable and freezes a target not named Luffy. Those cards are pretty solid for any green decks in general, but I think if you're going to play a green deck or a mono green deck, you're going to want to look to play Mihawk or Bonnie. Jinbei is one that probably is more of a for fun deck, and as a result, I'm going to put it at the F tier. But not before we're putting starter deck 21 Luffy in the very last spot. Next up, we have Green Zoro. I think also along the lines of Jinbei. We haven't seen results for it recently. Once again, results don't mean that much in the scope of its performance for the set, but I think we're going to be waiting on a starter deck for this leader for it to really be a good leader in general. The 7-cost Zoro is actually probably made for this leader, but pitching a card in order to get basically what is a Tashigi effect isn't great, although you have a 7/9 body the turn after. I'd rather just play Tashigi, or on 6, play something like a 6-cost Law instead and go really wide. I think Zoro will eventually be very good in upcoming sets. I think it's more of a rogue deck for right now, and it has potential to be a very good deck based off of what we get in the starter decks for it. Green Mihawk is just green good stuff, and of course, green good stuff being what it is a very strong thing to be. I think Mihawk, of course, is going to be able to hit pretty hard. It does suffer, once again, a lot of decks suffer from going against aggro decks and having 5k pokes. I think Mihawk hates going against those type of decks. I'm not entirely sure how it will fare against decks like Black Yellow Teach, but I do think that Mihawk is still a deck that is very strong overall and we'll continue to see it do well. I want to experiment a little bit more with the 7-cost Boa in this deck because it could be a very strong contender for the 7-cost spot, so we'll see how that plays out in this deck. But I'm going to put it at an event topping, probably towards the bottom end of it. I actually think Lucy, now that I think about it, probably belongs in a competitive tier, but we'll see how this shapes out. I might move Lucy down to B, but Mihawk in the meantime, I think is a strong competitive deck, probably a little bit better than Red Green Luffy, and maybe around the likes of Ace. Green Blue Zoro and Sanji probably actually takes pretty good advantage of the new support that comes out for Green Blue Luffy. I think that this deck is always going to be a rogue tier deck. It's one of those that has an ever-changing dynamic as far as the deck list goes. You can build it in multiple ways, whether you want to go more of like the Fishman Island package, if you want to have just green and blue good stuff, or if you want, you can build it more of an Impel Down package. I think that there's a lot of different ways to build it, so there's a lot of experimentation to be had with this leader. That being said, it is a rogue tier pick for me, and I think it will always be a rogue tier pick, which is very respectable for this leader. Green Blue Luffy, a new leader from OP16, is a 4-life leader, 5,000 power, as we so affectionately call him here. It's Goofy. Activate main once per turn. If you have only Impel Down type characters on your side of the field, you can then set 2 of your Dawn cards as active. So this, of course, you're able to at least get some efficiency out of playing bodies. A lot of bodies that you're playing replace themselves. They have draw 1 effects. So you're able to play small characters like 2-cost Bond Clay and then draw a card and then use your leader ability to restand and play another 2-cost character. So you have a lot of ways to be efficient with what you're doing. Because this is a 4-life leader and only has 5,000 power on defense, this can be somewhat of a glass cannon. You are being the aggressor here, so you need to be as aggressive as possible with this deck and get as many swings in, little chip swings where you can, and of course just let your bodies go because it's not worth protecting on defense, but you can build up a really big board really fast with this leader. This is a leader we'll see quite a lot of. I don't think it's quite an S tier deck because I think its weaknesses are because it's a glass cannon, can die pretty easily on crackbacks, so if you do play it correctly against this leader, you can win because of that, if you know its weaknesses there. With this being said, I do think it's an A tier deck. It's probably close to an S tier deck in general, just because when you're playing this deck, it feels great. It's probably one of the best decks to come out of OP16 as far as play goes. I think this and Black Yellow Teach are probably some of the more fun decks and feel good decks overall. It feels very powerful to be able to go very wide and then still have a very sizable hand at the same time. So with that being said, I think it's an A tier deck, probably towards the top end of A. Green Purple Limb didn't get much support this set. I think it's a pretty decent deck overall, but because it didn't get too much support and we didn't see too many results here and there in the last couple of sets, I think we'll continue to see the same amount of results in general, and that's not much. So that being said, it's a leave it locals deck for me, although you could experiment with the Sakazuki from the set in this deck. You could experiment a lot with the different cards in general, but I do think that Limb is one where if you go first, you're popping off. If you go second, it's a lot harder. Point being, it's one of those that is a deck that is very dice roll dependent if you go first or second, and with the lack of support for this set for it, I think it'll stay at the Leave It Locals tier. Green Purple Luffy is a deck that I will always respect, and I think it's one of those decks that if people put a lot of time into it, they'll probably do well with it. It's got a lot of defensive capabilities, of course, running Gum Gum Giant and being a 6k leader on offense and defense. You're running a lot of bodies that can help you go wide and be very Dawn efficient, and I think because of that, and of course you have a new couple of pieces of support with like the 4-cost 6,000 power Rush Luffy that when it swings, this is a green card by the way, when it swings you can rest any blocker, so that's actually huge for this leader. I would like to experiment with that in this deck. That being said, does it make it a very strong deck overall? I think it has a lot of potential. Probably one of the decks that has the most potential to do well in general. With that in mind, I do think that this is a deck that probably could be a competitive deck. It's one that has answers to things in the meta. It can change its deck list overall and adapt to what's going on. With that in mind, I think that it's probably a competitive deck, probably a little bit more than Bonnie in general, and probably around the same tier as maybe Green, Red, Luffy, and Ace for the time being. Although I do think that this deck has more upside than any of the other decks right here, right now. So that being said, I don't expect this to do well over the course of the meta. I could see it popping into the top 32 here and there. Will it win any events? It has to have a very strong bracket in order to do so and just dodge a lot of the bad matchups. So I'm hoping for this deck to do better, but I do think it's probably in the bottom to mid part of the competitive tier. Green, Black, Brook, one of my favorite decks to come out of the last set. I think that this deck is one that I find myself going back to and having a lot of fun with. But of course, I'm switching this out for a different deck for my fun deck for this set. We'll get to that in a little bit. Green, Black, Brook, I think is one that probably is going to continue to be a rogue deck. Some people will probably do well with it. Some people will probably not even play it. Most people will probably not play it. There's probably a few people out there that will do very well with it in general. It's one that I think that its game plan is very linear and you're going to see it coming every time, every game. It can be pretty consistent with what it's trying to do, playing the 8-cost Nami and then bringing out probably whatever best Straw Hat Crew character you can play in that turn is. The 7-cost Zoro that came out in green is an option for this leader. It is a very interesting option. I don't know if it's a good option, but it is one that you might want to consider. The 8-cost Nami can bring it out, and then of course you can rest anything and then put Dawn underneath your leader, pitching dead cards that you might need to put in the trash. So Green, Black, Brook is probably one that belongs in the rogue tier. I'll just put it here for right now. Green Yellow Yamato is still hanging around here. It didn't really get much support. I guess you could run the 7-cost Boa if you want to get experimental. I don't think the 8-cost Teach fits into this deck either. It's one of those that if you're going against a 5-life leader, which there's a fair amount of them, that you're probably going to have a difficult time because they just draw a lot of cards. And then once you get to the stages of the game where you need to close out against them, it's very difficult to be able to do so. I do think that Yamato will be able to really take advantage of going against 4-life leaders, which we have a couple in the top tier, but unfortunately we don't have enough for this leader for it to be that great. So I'm going to put it at the Leave It Locals. I would expect it to probably do well at locals, but probably outside of that, not very well. With Shirahoshi, I think I can kind of just echo what I just talked about with Yamato. You could run some of the other support pieces that we just got from this set with Boa or Teach. Does it make it a good leader in general? Probably not. I think it's one that we saw it in the Heroine Cup do very well, and I think that it is a strong leader and probably one that people don't really estimate correctly. They probably very underestimate it because it can't swing, but that doesn't mean it's a bad leader. But I'm going to put it to Leave It Locals. It's not a leader I would feel confident taking to a big tournament. On to Blue Kuzan, I think that this leader is one that it just needs support from the starter deck. We'll have to see what it gets. I'm not very confident in it being a good deck in general. This deck's power play is being able to bring out the 8-cost Garp with another 8,000 power body, which is strong, but when you have the new Sengoku in purple, being able to do 3 of those bodies in a turn in comparison to this, it doesn't really strike my fancy as a deck that's going to be incredibly impactful in this meta. We'll have to wait for the starter decks for this one to be a lot better. Blue Jinbei actually had some pretty decent results in OP15, popping into top 32s, actually into a lot of top cuts here and there. It's one of those decks that I think a lot of people just forgot about from the previous set, and rightfully so. When you go against a lot of yellow decks, Blue Jinbei can suffer because of the fact that it's trying to burst people down, and if an opponent keeps healing turn after turn after turn while also establishing blockers, it's very difficult for Jinbei to get past that, although they do have answers to be able to do that, but you have to have the answers in order to do that. And unfortunately for this leader, even though it did get Blue Jinbei unbanned, you can run it in this deck again, it's not quite enough, although it does change the landscape of how you build this deck. You don't necessarily have to run all Fishman Island, and you're not having to discard as many cards every turn because of that, because oftentimes in the previous set, at least OP14, you'd run Fisher Tiger, and then you'd have to discard cards to get down to 5 at the end of the turn. The deck list doesn't really run that anymore. It's running more of an aggressive variant where I guess they're all aggressive variants because you're playing small bodies and then putting Dawn underneath stuff. But that being said, you don't have to because you're running 7 Warlords of the Sea type characters with the Law. And of course, you could run Boa if you want to. You could run Jinbei, the unbanned one. So that being said, I do think that this leader has more potential, but I think it's probably more of a C tier deck. We'll probably see it pop its head here and there, but for the most part, probably not do too well in the OP16 meta. Blue Rebecca actually got a couple of pieces of support from this set, one of them being a blue Usopp blocker, and then one of them being the 7-cost Zoro, which can draw you a card if you have 6 or less in hand. Are you running that 7-cost Zoro in this deck? Likely not, but you could. I think it's more of an Usopp tech. Even then, I'm not sure if it belongs in that deck either. But that being said, Rebecca has always been pretty strong. It's like one of those decks that it can take people by surprise because it can go wide very fast. If you do go against decks that have 6k on defense or 7k on defense, you're going to have a really hard time against those leaders. So if you go against like Ace, or if you go against things that can buff themselves up on defense, good luck, because it's hard breaking through all of those defenses with only character swings. Unfortunately, your leader just doesn't swing here, but that doesn't really matter, I think, because if the leader swung, this deck might be a little bit too good. That being said, it's probably around the same tier as Jinbei. It's a strong rogue deck. It's one that just the core of what it does is good, and then it fits in like blue good stuff towards the top end or like the mid-tier package as well. So I think we'll probably not see too much of it in this next set, but maybe the couple that pilot it will probably end up popping off. On to Blue Buggy, a new leader from OP16 that reads Dawn ×1 once per turn. If one of your Impel Down type characters would be removed from the field, then you can instead play a Prisoner of Impel Down from your hand to replace it. So it's basically an insurance to make sure that you can go as wide as possible and keep that board intact as best you can. This leader is very annoying to play against because, unfortunately, if you try to get rid of their smaller bodies, they just play out the 2k counter from hand and instead have a 6k body to swing with the next turn. If you ignore the bodies, then they're just going to be poking you down every turn. So this is one of those decks that I think will have a pretty strong showing to begin with, but once you figure out how to play against it, it will be a lot easier to handle. That being said, I think it's a competitive deck. It's one where it will be annoying enough that we will see it probably be in the top 32 here and there. I don't have any confidence that it will win any tournaments in comparison to, I guess, its other Impel Down counterpart with Green Blue Luffy. I think Green Blue Luffy just does a much better job at keeping a huge hand size and also keeping a very wide board. I think Buggy can struggle from, oh, I only have a certain amount of Prisoner of Impel Down in my hand. You have to build your deck a certain way where you're running anywhere from like 16 to 20 Prisoner of Impel Downs to make sure that you actually have them on the draw. And then, of course, if your opponent starts poking down at your face and you need to get rid of 2Ks out of hand to be able to stay alive, you're getting rid of bodies that you could actually end up playing if they were swinging into your characters. So it's a very tricky deck to pilot in that regard, and I think it's kind of annoying for your opponent to have to deal with as well. So we will see this do okay. I think it's a deck that will probably end up seeing some consistency in the top 32 here and there. Blue Yellow Ace didn't get much in terms of support from this set other than the 8-cost Teach, and you could actually argue to run that in this set because why not? It's a good card in general, being able to heal back up and then also stack that life. Outside of that though, I think that you could run it a couple of different ways. In my previous video, I kind of had a hybrid build where you're running some Whitebeard Pirate package stuff with the 8-cost event plus the 10-cost Newgate. You could also have things like the 5-cost Luffy from the previous set to be able to have a very strong rush unit that your opponent won't be able to block or at least use counter events. Very strong overall. That being said, I don't think we'll see very much play with this deck, which is unfortunate because I do think it's a pretty strong rogue deck. Not pretty strong. It's just a rogue deck. It's a deck that I think if someone is really just putting a lot of time and focus into it and they know the deck well, they know the matchups well, you could probably do well in a tournament. Oh boy, Blue Yellow Nami, a deck that we saw top tremendous amounts of time in the OP15 set. How will it do in OP16? I think that it will continue to be a very strong deck. We have a lot of just toolbox variety with this leader. Of course, running the secret rare 8-cost Teach is something that I've been talking about for all the yellow decks, but especially for Nami, you could run that in this deck. I think it's a pretty strong card overall. Being able to stack that life, so eventually when it does get triggered, then you're set for that turn. So I think that Blue Yellow Nami is going to continue to be an S tier deck, but I think it will actually suffer against some of the other decks that will be popping up in the meta. I think with the rise of Ace and maybe Shanks doing a little bit better, and of course Lucy always just like looming in the background, Nami is probably one that is going to suffer a little bit more in the OP16 meta. That being said, she's still a really good deck. She's a direct answer to Purple Enel, and we need decks like this to be able to counteract what is going to be, once again, spoiler alert, the best deck in the format. So Purple Enel, because it will be the best deck in the format in my opinion, and this is a direct answer to it, I think it will continue to be a strong meta-defining deck. People will still have to play around this leader. It won't do necessarily as well against Black Yellow Teach Teach, for instance, because of course Teach with the 10 cost blocker Teach can turn off this leader ability, and with this leader ability gone, it actually takes out a lot of the wind out of the sails for this leader to be such a strong offensive and defensive behemoth. So it will still be a good deck overall. It's one of the best decks out there. If you're wanting to play this into the OP16 meta, you'll still do well. Don't worry about that. But I do think because some of the other decks we're seeing rise up with some of the top end that we're seeing come out in some of these decks, it might have some difficulty to begin with. Blue-yellow Boa has actually just fallen off the face of the earth, it feels like. Obviously, Nami became the oppressive blue-yellow deck. I think the reason is because Boa has to build a very specific way with the Kuja Pirates in order to really take advantage of what she's trying to do. If you are wanting to run more of the yellow Thriller Bark Pirates, you could, especially with the 6-cost Moria that will allow you apparently to draw 3 times for every body that comes out. So really strong play for Boa, but you're having to rely on that to be a really strong play, which is not easy to do with this leader. That said, I think that because she's overshadowed by blue-yellow Nami, we won't see too many people play this leader. It's a very scary leader against certain decks, and for that reason, I think she's probably the strongest rogue pick, which is a little weird because of the fact that I feel like she was such a strong pick a couple of sets ago, but I think that we'll probably just see her not do too well in the OP16 meta as well. Blue-purple Luffy, of course, with its leader ability being so strong as it is, stacking the top of your life, drawing a card every turn on top of the original draw that you have. I think this leader is going to continue to be one that you should at least keep in your mind. You probably won't see it quite a lot in this next set, but I do think that's one that is still worth running. I think it's a rogue tier deck because I think that some people that will run it will be able to see their curve every time, go Sanji, Roger. It's changed its dynamic because it used to be Sanji Mihawk, but of course Sanji Roger is very strong. Sanji Boa is another combo we've been seeing with this leader, and I think it has answers to certain things in the meta. It will just unfortunately be ran over by a lot of decks that can just poke it down every turn, which we'll see quite a lot of. Green-blue Luffy being one of those is going to be quite a menace. Unfortunately, this matchup against Ace was one that you could actually be pretty confident in running as blue-purple Luffy, but because you don't run as much removal, I think this is a deck that suffered from the rotation, unfortunately, and eventually it will probably rise back up. But in the meantime, it's just waiting in the wings to be able to be a good leader again. Blue-purple Sanji also kind of suffered from the same thing that blue-purple Luffy did. Losing Red Rock definitely hurt this leader quite a lot because it was in a spot where with the Reiju that can play things out of trash, made it very difficult to take care of this leader because it would answer your bodies plus also establish its own. Unfortunately, it doesn't do nearly as well without Red Rock. A lot of the deck lists have kind of just cut that Reiju out altogether, but it is probably worth running at least a 1 or 2 of because we'll have decks like purple, yellow, Rosinante really rise up and do well in this meta, and having answers to that with Gravity Blade and being able to play the Gravity Blade out of trash while also establishing character is huge. So I do think that this has certain matchups in which it is really good against, and as a result, I think it's one of those rogue decks that we might see here and there. I think it's one of those that's actually towards the top end of rogue, and looking at how we have the rogue list right now, I actually might want to move some things around, like maybe Ace is a little bit better than I anticipate here. Probably around this is what I would expect, and then the rest of these are probably fine. Blue-black Usopp, a deck that also is very close to heart here. I like a lot of the Dressrosa type support leaders, I suppose. This leader, like I mentioned, got a couple pieces of support with the 2-cost Usopp blocker, which can bounce a 5-cost back to the opponent's hand by resting your leader or stage, and then of course the 7-cost Zoro, which can draw a card if you have 6 or less in hand. So I think both of those cards are fine. I don't know if they're necessarily going to change what this leader does altogether or make it a stronger leader. Yes, it will be stronger, but will I want to take it to a big tournament? Probably not. It's more of a cope deck in general. I think last set was a really good time to start playing this as more of a fun deck. It's probably a leave it locals for me, although I could argue that it is a rogue deck with some good matchups. Purple Foxy is also one of those decks that has just direct answers to certain leaders. Being able to tap down a leader every turn and one character is incredibly powerful, and then also having access to Sakazuki to be able to use that -6,000 effect is something you should consider for this leader. So as a result, I think that he's a pretty decent rogue tier. I don't expect him to actually have any results this set, but he's one of those that has very interesting niche matchups, and the matchups he does well against end up being some really random, like strong decks. So I could see Foxy popping off here and there. Will it top? Probably not, but it could have potential. I've heard a lot of talk about purple Doflamingo just falling off altogether in this meta. And I'm kind of curious as to what the thought process is there, because not a lot has changed for him, and he was already somewhat of a strong matchup, especially against Purple Enel. Of course, Black Yellow Teach could be a different story for this leader, and the argument is why not just play Black Yellow Teach instead, because it's a very similar ability, but Black Yellow Teach has much better support, or at least just a better card pool to be able to play from. But I do think that this is a leader that has a good Purple Enel matchup, and that's good enough for me. I think it's a competitive deck. I think we probably won't see too much of it, but it's one of those that will continue to do its thing, be a strong deck overall, be annoying for people to play against. The reason Black Yellow Teach's ability is considered to be good is also because it's very similar to this one, except you don't have to do much except Dawn -1, and you get access to Sakazuki. So I do think that this is still going to be a deck to consider for the OP16 meta. Purple Enel, pretty easy. This is an S tier meta-defining deck. It was the deck that everyone had to learn how to play against and how to beat in the last set, and I think that it's going to continue to be such a strong deck going into this set. Nothing changed for it, but nothing needed to change for it. I think that it's just going to continue to be a deck that we'll see people do well with. It has such a high ceiling when played to the highest level, and because people have had a whole set to play with it and perfect it and get it down, now all they have to do is just learn all of the new matchups from OP16, and to be quite honest, all of the decks that come out in OP16 are going to struggle against Purple Enel other than Black Yellow Teach. I think that's the only one that will actually do well against Purple Enel because you have access to something called 5-cost Wiper. But with that in mind, Purple Enel will do well against pretty much every other deck out there. So it should come as no surprise that it is going to be the best deck in the format and continue to be an S tier deck. Purple Yellow Robin is one that I will always consider, especially if yellow is a strong factor into a meta, because she is just such anti-yellow coded despite being yellow herself. The banish on her leader ability is just too good against those yellow decks, but specifically against yellow decks. So I think that she is a leave it locals, because I don't think that she's going to be one that you would want to take to a big tournament, because if you go against anything that's not yellow, you might have some problems. Yellow decks, though, you'll probably do well against and eat up pretty easily. Then we have a new leader from OP16 in Purple Sengoku. He's a 5-life leader that says activate main. You may return 8 of your active Dawn cards, and then you can play up to 3 Admirals from your hand. I actually think that this is the worst deck to come out of OP16. It doesn't really have a strong early game that's going to impact the board. You're not putting a lot of pressure on your opponent. The most you're going to be doing is playing the 5-cost Garp or the 2K Sengoku to be able to ramp up to 8 so you can use your leader ability. Being able to get out 3 8,000 power bodies does put a lot of pressure on the opponent, but you're losing a lot of cards in the process of doing that. So if you want to stay healthy, you're going to have to be countering out very aggressively, which means that by the time you do get to be able to play your leader ability, you're dropping 3 more cards from your hand, usually going down to like 1 to 3 cards, which can be really hurtful to then close out a game at that point, despite the fact that you have these big bodies, or rather these mid-range bodies that are going to be difficult for your opponent to deal with off the bat, but eventually they'll be able to take care of them. Of course, the Sakazuki, which came out for this leader, is a very strong card, and one of the reasons why Sengoku's even being considered for somewhat of a competitive deck. I gotta be honest, it's a deck that I just think suffers from not having enough card draw, enough card quality, enough top end. It's one of those where if you want to stay healthy early, like I said, you're gonna have to aggressively counter out. If you do take a lot of life, then by the time that you're down to like 2 life and you establish the big bodies, it might be a little bit too late for that to really be effective. So I know that some people do think that this leader is very good. I think it's a rogue deck. I don't think it's necessarily one that you're just going to outright disregard from OP16, but I wouldn't confidently bet on this one, but maybe time will tell differently there. Purple Yellow Rosinante, I would say, is one of the biggest winners to come out of the OP16 set because of the fact that it just can play a lot of the Sengoku support along with it, because it does have the typing of Navy, so you have access to be able to use all of those cards to the full effect. So I think that Purple Yellow Rosinante is a scary deck. The fact that it now has access to the -6,000 Sakazuki makes it very difficult for you to want to really swing into them, so you don't want to lose your board. I think it's one that you're going to have to learn how to play against, and it's one that I'm really scared to go against, to be quite honest. I think it's a really good deck. It does run a lot of bricks, but when it has a lot of blockers that just don't die because of its leader ability, does having a lot of bricks in hand really matter? I mean, it's one of those where if you know how to beat it, you know how to beat it, but a lot of people are going to go into this matchup and realize that the deck just feels very strong overall. I think it will still struggle against some of the decks in the top end, but I think we're going to be seeing this at an event topping level where it can consistently get into the top 16 and maybe even win events here and there. Purple Black Luffy, another leader that I really just enjoy playing. Unfortunately, I don't think is a leader that we're going to want to play into the OP16 meta. You do have, like I said, access to the Sakazuki. I keep reiterating that. That's a strong card for purple in general and could be a good card for Luffy. But I think the identity that it received from the previous set, of course, with the Brook support, will continue to be the best way to really play this leader. That being said, I don't see it doing well in general, and I think it's one that you're just going to want to leave at the locals. Black Lucci was a leader that got a lot of support from EBO4, but unfortunately didn't get too much in terms of support for this set. I think if you're going to want to play this, it's more for on the fun side. The 4-cost Lucci is just a fun card to play in general in this deck, and if you're going like the Turbo Lucci build, it's very enjoyable, but unfortunately it doesn't perform quite well enough, so we're going to put it at the Leave It Locals tier. Very similarly to Foxy, Black Teach has matchups that he does extremely well into, and I think that we'll probably see some people pick Black Teach back up, although I don't think he's going to be an incredible pick for this meta. He's more of a rogue tier pick in my opinion, where we'll see him probably rise up, and if he has an insane matchup spread over the course of 9 rounds, then he'll do very well. And of course, Blackbeard kind of being an anti-yellow deck in general, I think that this could be a strong pick as a rogue tier deck, but I don't expect too much from it overall. When Black Yamato was first announced, a lot of people, myself included, thought that the leader ability was absolutely garbage. Being able to give your Land of Wano type characters rush when being played out of the trash with no support in sight felt awful. But of course, now that everything has come out and we've seen the OP16 set in full, it feels a little bit better, and to be quite honest, I've been really enjoying this deck. Green Black Brook was my deck of choice for fun in the previous set, and going into OP16, this is the deck that I really enjoy playing. There's a lot of variety actually to how you can build it out, like a lot of small tech pieces you can add here and there, and it's surprisingly very strong and aggressive. Being able to get multiple swings in a turn, you can get up to like 7 or 8 swings in a turn based off of your combos if you play them correctly, is very strong. I think we'll consistently see it be in top cut, probably easily get into top 16 as well. So I'm going to put this in the A tier, probably around Ace. I think it's a pretty strong deck we'll see, maybe along the same lines as Crocodile, just being an interesting black deck that has its own identity, but also an identity that's very strong at what it does. I'm happy to play this deck, and I'm hoping that we'll see it do well in OP16. Black Yellow Luffy has received quite a lot of support over the past couple of sets. Of course, ever since Moria was banned, this leader had such a nosedive into the meta, unfortunately just didn't see itself recuperate well enough to be able to be considered strong. And I think it will continue to also be one of those where it will be a rogue deck. I think people will probably try to play around with it. It's probably more of a leave it locals, but although I will want to experiment with this with the A-cost Teach, it could slot nicely into this deck. But unfortunately, we just haven't seen results from this leader, especially with the people that are so in love with this leader and haven't been able to perform. I think it just struggled ever since the ban list came out with Moria. So maybe if Moria is ever unbanned, or if we get an effect very similar to that, then I could see this being a strong leader. It's a very fun leader, and I do think it has a lot of potential. I could see it being in the rogue tier, but I'm not confident enough to put it in there quite yet. Black Yellow Moria, I think, is a competitive deck. We probably won't see it do nearly as well as it has done in previous sets, because I think the flavor of the month being Black Yellow Teach, we'll see a lot more of that. But it did get a couple of pieces of support, or rather, the 6-cost Moria is something you could add into this deck as a spicy addition to get that trigger off of life, and then get 3 bodies out of life that are going to be incredibly annoying to deal with. So I think Moria will be a competitive deck. It probably is more so like on the borderline of rogue or competitive. And I think that people will probably get upset that I put it at the bottom of B, but it's one of those where I think it has a very strong game plan. It's very difficult to deal with for some decks, but I think it's probably just being slowly phased out for different decks in this set. Black Yellow Teach, being a new 4-life leader from OP16, has a couple of interesting effects. One of them is that on your opponent's turn, your characters gain +1 cost, so making it a little bit harder for people to remove those characters. And then the second part of this, on the opponent's attack, once per turn, you can pitch 1 card with trigger from your hand to redirect that attack to either your leader or one of your Blackbeard Pirates characters. And you have a bunch of characters in this set from Blackbeard Pirates to be able to have a lot of on-KO effects, very similarly to how Purple Doflamingo has on-KO ability characters. And so you being able to redirect those attacks for having those effects is very strong. The support it got outside of that is also very strong with the 6-cost Shiryu. It has a trigger of draw 2 cards. You can also put a card into the top of your life, so you're able to heal on 6, and then on 8, of course, I've been talking about it this entire video, the A-cost Teach incredibly impactful for this leader. You also have the ACOST Zihaha event to be able to cheat out those bodies and then also force your opponent to take a life. And that being said, the 10 cost blocker teach is incredibly impactful in this deck and a must run. It's so strong in the mono black Blackbeard deck. So of course it's going to be ran in this deck as well. This deck does struggle against decks that can go wide and really poke it down, but it has answers to those. And if you have answers to some of your worst matchups, then I think that this deck is a meta defining deck. People are going to have to learn how to play around it. A lot of people will be playing it. And I think that people that have put a lot of time into it will do very well with it. It's a very tricky deck to get around. Being able to block something with your 10 cost blocker and then just for one card block it again essentially by redirecting it is incredibly annoying. So I'm going to put it into the S tier. I think it has a decent matchup against Purple NL. I think Purple NL in general is just going to have a better matchup spread in the whole overall scheme of the meta. But I think Black Yellow Teach is going to be a deck we'll see win a lot. Yellow Nell just does not die, literally taking its leader ability into effect IRL. The fact that ACOST Teach is not leader locked and you can run it in this deck makes this leader actually still worth running. I understand that this leader is probably hated across a lot of the fan base that plays this game, but that being said, you should still respect it. It has a couple of different ways to build it with the aggression, or you can go more tall, and I think the fact that it's just hard to kill for a lot of people, a lot of decks in general, it will still be around, and I think it will continue to perform. I'm going to put it in the competitive tier. I think it's probably closer to maybe around here, towards the top end of competitive, middle tier of competitive. I think that we will probably not see a lot of people play it because, once again, it's an old leader, and there's other leaders that people might want to play instead. But it continues to just be the best of yellow with a really strong generic leader ability, and so we'll continue to see it do well in general. I really like Yellow Calgara. It's an interesting take on yellow. It doesn't run a lot of the other yellow support that we see other decks take advantage of, but it is a deck I don't think we'll see very much of, and even then it's gotten pieces of support over time, and it just still hasn't been able to perform quite as well as I had hoped it would perform. And I think we'll continue to see that same thing going into OP16. I think it's a deck you're probably just going to want to leave at locals, but it is a very strong deck in general. Starter deck 29 Luffy is a deck. It's one that is just generically yellow good stuff. And if you're playing generically yellow good stuff, there's probably other decks you want to play instead that could take better advantage of those triggers or just bodies in general. So unfortunately for the starter deck 29 yellow Luffy fans, I'm going to put it at the leave it locals because I don't really think that this deck, if you know how to play against it, it's a deck that you're probably just going to be able to take advantage of very easily. The advantage of this deck, though, is that it is a 6-life leader. So if you can't close out the game quick enough and you end up taking too much chip damage, it can do well, but overall, I think there's better decks out there to play. Speaking of better yellow decks to play, I think Bell Luffy is an arguably better deck to play, although it doesn't play the same cards as starter deck 29 Luffy. This leader did well last set, and I think it will continue to do well this set. It's a competitive deck where it's difficult for the opponent to take care of the board because you can just protect your board at all costs. Is it a deck that I think will be an event-topping deck? Probably not. I think it's more of a competitive deck, probably around here, if I were to say where it belongs. I think it's a strong deck and we'll continue to see it do well. It probably is around the top 10 or maybe fall right outside the top 10 decks of this set, but I'm pretty confident that Bell Luffy is going to continue to be a strong deck. And with that, I believe that these are the best decks to play out of the OP16 meta. I think that for the S, A, and B, they're pretty accurate in my opinion as far as what I would be confident taking to tournaments. As far as the C and the F tier, those can be a free-for-all as far as where they fall in line. But I do think that the best decks are going to continue to be Purple Enel and Blue Yellow Nami, with Black Yellow Teach rising up and doing really well. I'm excited to see how this meta shapes out. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about the tier list overall. What could be different? Please let me know, but please also be respectful when doing so. OP16 content is coming right around the corner soon. We'll start with the coverage next week. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.